Hey y'all, how's it going? Well, I hope you liked part one on what all we can do to use up those cherry tomatoes. This will be part two. In part one, I showed you 3 different ways to store and use your cherry tomatoes. In part two, I'm going to show you 4, maybe 5 ways to use and preserve those cherry tomatoes, to include a couple of recipes. So picking up with number 4 is dehydrating them. I'm going to show you exactly how to do that, and then after they're dehydrated, I will show you how to rehydrate and how to use. I started with 2 pounds of cherry tomatoes, filled up one of my trays. Now this sheet right here is actually what's called a Teflon sheet, and it perfectly fits the size of my Excalibur trays. It's heat resistant and it's non-stick, and it's very, very good to use when you have juicy things. You can reuse them too. They're very easy to clean after use. When I dehydrate tomatoes, they're cut in half, and I always make sure that I place them skin side down. The reason is it's kind of like a little boat, and all of that sweetness and the moisture the juice will penetrate into the tomato that way. 2 pounds of these cherry tomatoes filled up 3 trays. I put in my dehydrator at 135 degrees, and it's going to take around 15 hours, so I start in the evening and check them in the morning. The following morning, I checked the tomatoes and I removed each tomato as it felt done. It should not feel tacky or sticky at all. And don't be surprised if you have to leave thicker ones in for longer to finish. But remember, it's most people's opinions that are master dehydrators that you cannot over dehydrate the food. You want it dry. Now here I am turning the tray around, checking each one again to see which ones are dry, and if you're unsure, just leave it in there. We live in a very humid area, so by the feel of it, it looks to me like it's going to take anywhere from 2 to 4 more hours to make sure that they are completely dry. They may feel bendable, but again, they should not feel tacky or have any moisture in them. So now it's time to talk about optional ways to store them. In this pint mason jar here, I am loading my little dried cherry tomatoes. It's amazing, isn't it, how much 2 pounds of tomatoes will take up such a small space when dehydrated. Now in the right one there, I'm adding an oxygen absorber and adding the lid. You could vacuum seal it too at this point, but actually the oxygen absorber will partially vacuum seal it, and you'll see that lid pop inward. In the other jar, I am adding some garlic and a lot of olive oil. I'm going to be storing these in the refrigerator, and you need to use them within 4 days. But it's very important that you completely cover the tomatoes in the oil. Don't have any exposed tomatoes. So I'm closing it up and taking it to the refrigerator to use, as I said, within 4 days. The other jar I am labeling Very important to do that and put the date on there. If you're going to store these like this with an absorber and or whether or not you vacuum sealed the lid, I would say it's best to use it within 6 months. Need to keep it in a cool, dry, dark place. The other option is to actually put them in a freezer. Here I'm showing you how easy it is, how crisp they actually will get. These are great just to crunch them up into salads or whatever you would like for a little extra crunch. You can rehydrate tomatoes very quickly. You can soak them simply in warm water, salt water, wine, balsamic vinegar. A lot of people like to use broth, vegetable or chicken broth, to give it a little bit extra flavor. And you just soak them until soft and the skin can be pierced with a fork. It doesn't take very long, maybe 20 minutes. After soaking, you can drain them and put them on a paper towel, or just start adding them to your favorite things: salads, omelets, pizza, frittatas, sauteed vegetables. Here I'm actually using them to make a pesto. This is great on pasta, pizza, part of a cheese board, or even mixed in with roasted veggies. Honestly, I could eat it by the spoonful. How about spreading it on garlic bread or bruschetta? Use as a dip for crackers or pita dips. This is just a 5-minute thing here in a food processor. Just sun-dried tomatoes, fresh basil, Parmesan cheese, pine nuts, garlic, and olive oil. It's yummy stuff. And of course you can modify how much you add of each ingredient. I decided to use it this morning at brunch on top of a little bit of my Sicilian meat roll. Stay tuned, that recipe's coming up. Yummy. Store the rest in the fridge and use it up within 4 days. Number 5, I love roasting. Before roasting my cherry tomatoes, I like to get all of the ingredients that I plan to use out and ready to go. It's just more fun that way than doing it one at a time. And here I am prepping my garlic. Can't have roasted cherry tomatoes without garlic. I took a mixed variety of cherry tomatoes and cut them in half. I would say it was probably, roughly about 2 pints. I put about half of my tomatoes in a bowl and generously added some ground pink Himalayan sea salt and peppercorns. And of course, must add the garlic. I didn't really mince it. It was rather crushed from the way I removed the skins. So I just put slivers in. Some oregano and basil fresh from the garden. And of course, you must add some quality olive oil, and a generous amount. Give it a good stir. Coat everything very well. Now I'm placing it on a parchment-lined sheet pan, and I like to take the time to turn each of the tomatoes over skin side up. It's ready to go in the oven for a slow roast, 250 degrees for about 3 hours. Ah, bella. We're going to kick it up a notch with this variety. I put the rest of my tomatoes in my bowl there, and I chopped the garlic, added rosemary and shallots and some fresh thyme. I didn't take the leaves off the thyme. And we're going to add a generous splash of Italian white wine vinegar. And again, lots of olive oil. I made sure to place the thyme here and there just on top of the tomatoes. And again, it's going in with the others in the oven, 250 degrees, for about 3 hours. Oh my, I wish you could smell it. I stored each of these in Ziploc bags in the refrigerator. And then the next morning, ooh, I added some of that first batch to some scrambled eggs. So good. Do you like Italian food? Well, we sure do. And this recipe is a family fave. Sicilian meat roll. If you'd like the recipe, it's going to be next up in the videos. But I'm using so many things that I've already shown you. Some of the dried tomato skin powder and some of my sauce. And now we're going to be adding in some of those roasted cherry tomatoes in a special way. I'm grinding them up in my little food processor. And spreading it like that wonderful tomato glaze. This Italian dish gets more Italian with prosciutto ham in the center of the meat roll. And of course, some fresh mozzarella. There's my meat roll, ready to go in the oven. After the Sicilian meat roll has cooked for about an hour, I'm adding some mozzarella. And now it's time to make a side dish. Grabbing some Sauvignon Blanc. You can use chicken stock if you prefer, but the dry white wine really adds a very nice flavor, and the alcohol content does cook away. This recipe calls for 8 ounces of the dry white wine, and it also calls for a smidge extra creamy goat cheese, herbed creamy goat cheese, 8 ounces of them. I have 2 different packages here. And honestly, I really think the best way to crumble up your cheese is with a pair of very clean hands. To get our creamy goat cheese pasta going, I have a hot pan here and I'm adding 2 tablespoons of olive oil and 4 cloves of garlic. And you only want to cook the garlic about 30 seconds. Don't let it burn. Add in your dry white wine. And then your crumbled up herbed goat cheese. Stir it in until your goat cheese blends in with your wine sauce. Add some freshly ground salt and pepper too. Bring your sauce to a simmer and you want to cook it for 1 minute. The pasta is cooking. I test it. You want to cook it to al dente, but I do 2 things. First, I taste it for tenderness, and then I do the Italian filling. And if it sticks, it's just right. And there she blows. Add the pasta to the wonderful creamy goat cheese sauce. Get it all nicely mixed. And we're going to top this with some of those great roasted tomatoes. If you're wondering what I'm brushing on these garlic knot rolls, stay tuned. In about 30 seconds, I'm going to show you what that is and how to make it. And dinner is almost served. Sicilian meat roll, fresh green beans from the garden, and goat cheese creamy pasta with roasted tomatoes. Number 6, how about some creamy tomato butter with those roasted tomatoes? If it's one thing we can make before pumpkin spice takes over everything in a couple of months, it's roasted tomato butter. Here I am using that second batch of tomatoes, you know, the one with the white wine vinegar and the rosemary and oregano and thyme. It's about a cup, and I'm chopping it up very well in my little food processor. Now I have a stick of unsalted butter here that I'm adding to the food processor, about a tablespoon at a time to blend it easily. I did not add any extra salt, but you could add maybe 1/4 of a teaspoon of kosher salt. But remember, I already had salt in the roasted tomatoes. Now here I'm tasting it just to see if it's buttery enough. And it was wonderful, but I still wanted to add about a tablespoon and a half more. So that's what I'm doing here. Now, if you'll take all that buttery goodness and put it on a piece of saran wrap, and I roll it up like a log. Easy to do. Oh my goodness. Look at that orange tomato buttery goodness. Now I'm placing it in the refrigerator overnight. And the next morning I used my Food Saver vacuum sealer because I want to freeze the majority of this butter, and it will keep in the freezer for up to 3 months. So I've cut 4 bags, sealed one end, and now I am making sure I'm labeling it with my date. Getting some more saran wrap out, plastic wrap. And I'm cutting it in little sections in the amount that I think I might use. And can you imagine the possibilities? Just over pasta, a pasta salad, or hot pasta. It would also be excellent used with chicken. I do a gravy recipe that I really love where I render down some really good chicken stock and then add the butter in and whisk it and pour it over baked chicken. It's excellent. And last but not least, you can't forget grown-up ketchup. Tomato jam. After all my tomatoing, I only had 2.5 pounds of cherry tomatoes left. So this is a half a recipe of jam. So we have the 2.5 pounds plus 1.25 cups of sugar, 4 tablespoons of bottled lime juice, 1 teaspoon of freshly grated ginger. The additional spices are 1/2 teaspoon of cinnamon, 1/4 teaspoon of ground cloves, a 1/2 tablespoon of salt, and 1/2 tablespoon of red chili flakes for a little bit of zing. Now I'm turning my burner on to high, and I'm going to bring it to a boil. Stirring, stirring. After we bring it to a rolling boil, we're going to then turn the heat to low and simmer until it becomes a sticky, jammy mess. After an hour of cooking, this is how much it had reduced. Actually, I'm showing you there where it was when it started, and it's way less than half now, but it's still not thick enough. Well, you might wonder what in the world I'm doing here. Well, it's an experiment. Using some small canning rings and some zip ties, I am trying to build myself a tray for the bottom of a smaller pot, because this jam is just going to be in little tiny jars, and I really don't want to have to use my great big water canner when I can just use a pasta pot. So, we're going to see if this works. One of my friends from Facebook group page, Debbie Turner, she and I were talking, and she's the one that suggested this idea to create a rack for the bottom of my stainless steel pot there. Debbie, you are so smart, because it's going to work just fine. So here I am finishing getting all of the jars filled, and I'm going to get it on the stove and get it going so it will be ready to start filling and water bath cannon. The tomato jam is done, and look how gooey, yummy, yummy, yummy. I think it took probably 2 hours. Now I'm going to get my jar lifter and bring over the first little baby jar. Using the funnel, I'm going to fill up that 4-ounce jar until it is 1/4 of an inch from the top. Using the non-pointy end of a wooden skewer, I am poking and poking to get the bubbles out. Checking again just to make sure I'm at 1/4 of an inch from the top. Now you want to wipe the rim with a wet paper towel. Some folks recommend that you actually soak your paper towel or rag in vinegar, because that further cuts anything that might be on the rim. Now normally I would be using my little magnetic, whatever you call it, to pick up those lids. But somehow or another, my magnet has left the building. I store it in a basket in the pantry, which is about eye level to Cooper. I think he was involved in the snatch. After processing for the recommended amount of time, you turn the fire off, take the lid off, let it rest for 5 minutes before taking it out and taking them to, a towel-covered countertop works well. You also need to hold it straight and let some of that water on the top of the lid evaporate before you take it away. So here we are, 5 little 4-ounce jars of sweet and spicy tomato jam. Yummy. Now, the next morning, after letting it rest for 24 hours, I am labeling the jar. So important. Helps you remember how long it's going to be good for. You can store this for roughly about a year in a cold or cool and dry location. Also, after the 24 hours, you need to check to make sure the seals are good, and this is the way you do that. Use your thumbs, try to pry it up. If any of them do pry up, you need to put it in the fridge and use it up. I store my canned goods without the ring, but I'm putting one back on because it's going to be a present for my son and daughter-in-law. Again, I hope you enjoyed this video. Stay tuned for more recipes to come. If you're interested in that Sicilian meat roll recipe, it's next. So remember, bye and have a good one.